Good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome you all to this surface webinar series. And today, uh, Professor Arvind Vichek is going to deliver back to basics some reflection. This is a two-part lecture series. The first part will be delivered today, and the next part will be delivered in month of April. Uh, I guess that you must have received all of the invitations. So, let me introduce Vichek sir. Abhay Vichek sir was graduated from the St. Xavier College and then joined Department of Mathematics, University of Mumbai, where he obtained his SSAT. Later, he joined the Economics Department, University of Mumbai, obtained MA and PhD degree. Apart from that, getting the several awards and distinctions, he was gold medalist at MA. He was awarded two postdoc scholarship, one at Cambridge University and another University of Austin, Texas, where that he was a Fulbright scholar. Uh, then he was a professor of econometrics, Lakadawala chair professor in the planning and development, and Vibhuti Shukla chair in urban economics and regional development at Mumbai University of Mumbai University. He was distinguished fellow at ORM. Until recently, he was a senior resident fellow at Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy. Currently, that he is the chair of academic board of NISM and the special advisor to Vice Chancellor of Local Institute of Politics and Economics. Welcome, sir. Let me share this the one thing before he starts the lecture. Wealth of Nations. So he is going to talk about the Adam Smith and David Ricardo today. Wealth of Nations, the first was published on 9th March 1776. So that means almost 247 years later, again that we are talking about Smith. So we are waiting for you, sir. Thank you. Over to you.
Who directed me to take this special lecture. I can promise you that once I start talking about giving lectures, difficult to stop. It's a habit of 40 years. So I will continue to fill up the Thursday slots, talking about the current researches and other things that I've done. But today what I've decided to do is to talk about the classics. The reason why I have chosen to talk about Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and McCain is that basically, of course, all of them are people who have influenced me. I've read the works, and these are important people. So, what's my motivation? The motivation is that social sciences don't progress by process of sedimentation, like these natural sciences do. That you have redundancies and you throw them away and look at what is the latest. What happens oftentimes is that we come up with current problems, and the current tools are seen to be important, that we turn backwards to the masters to see their insights and see whether we can use those to kind of get some insights into today's problems. The second thing is I found that in doing the superstructures, sometimes these things, the history of economic thought, the older masters, kind of gets away and out of our syllabi. So, kind of reminding us about these things. I personally find these people very inspirational, and that's why the search for the man, to turn the phrase, which is a French phrase, search for the woman in detective stories, there says the term, search for the man. Because in the area kind of equations and diagrams that we do in economics, personally, again, I found it to be more engaged in economics if I knew the people and their times. And I don't know, some of you might pick up that kind of a thing. And you understand some of these people in their own words. Again, I take this clue from the great mathematician Abel. When he was asked, he unfortunately died of poverty at the age of 24. But before that, he did some fantastic work. And when he was asked, how is it that you managed to get to these heights? His response was, he said, I always read the masters, not the pupils. So it's not the textbooks, however good that they are. Sometimes the students have this feeling that the old masters and their works might be very difficult. How will I understand it? I can assure you that most of the masters that I'll be talking about, except possibly Marx, are actually easier to read in the original and more insightful, and it stays with you. So these are some of the motivational reasons why I am talking to you about this. Now, we are essentially a breed of storytellers, and good ones are persuasive, and most of them, as we shall probably see, but now that I'm saying it just now, I'll not repeat it. Ricardo's work essentially arises out of the marginal notes that he made on Smith's work. So all the time we keep on building on what we had earlier. It also teaches you to be confident but modest. You know, hindsight, as they say, is always 20/20, but history makes the fool of best of us. So when we see what Smith was saying or Ricardo was saying and how, in a sense, foolish or wrong they were, you can feel confident, but you ought to feel a bit modest about what you say too. So this is a selective things. I'm not doing it comprehensively. The vice chancellor diktat was that I am not to do any research or do anything. Just reflect on what I studied and what I taught in the beginning, first 10 odd years of my career. Smith Ricardo, apart from the original works, and for that I must thank one of my teachers, Professor Naxley, who told me, he said, Abhay, forget about lectures, don't go to them. They will not teach you much. Go to the library, read the masters. So Smith Ricardo, I mean, that was in Mumbai University. So the students here, you are blessed with good teachers, so this doesn't apply to you. So Kavita Reddy is somebody who's very, very underrated and who had retired by the time I joined, but she used to take, I still don't understand why, but every day 20 minutes of her time, come and seek me in the library, me and Romarin, and talk to us about what we were reading, what we were doing, and so on. Extremely insightful professor who taught me a lot about Smith and Ricardo. Marx, of course, Meghnad Desai's book on lectures on Marx in economics continues to be the best kind of exposition of Marx. And you can count it amongst the others, everybody, including, you know, all the known experts from Cambridge and so on. Keynes, the original general theory, which I happened to get when it was being weeded out in St. Xavier's College, which is my college, for 5 rupees. So, like a typical middle class guy, I said, so I took it. I read it, and it was excellent. And of course, Professor Brahman, who, as Lord Meghnad Desai says, perhaps the best exponent of Keynes. So this is not going to be an exhaustive research kind of a thing, rendering. It is a stories, some of them trivia also. So this is his time period, and Adam Smith, often referred to as grandfather or father of economics. He was not incidentally the first professional economist. I will give you about 15 minutes to parallelly think unless somebody will tell me who was the first economist or a professor of economics that was so appointed. Yeah, or later on I'll come to that. But so this begins with it. Now, this bunch of people, these classical economists, were people whom Baumol characterized as magnificent economists. These were times when they were not scared of values being there in economics. You know, they were happy to tell the state what to do in order to improve the welfare of the people and the state in general. The whole idea of doing Newton to economics, which started with John Stuart, and then, of course, the whole Leontief, forget Leontief, Marie Esprit Walra, and Wilfredo Pareto, and Wicksell, ending up with Alfred Marshall, 1890 to 1920s. This was the heyday of neoclassical economics. We're not going to be talking about them here, but that was going to happen 100 years later. These were chaps who didn't mind that value entered ground floor of economics. So far as they made it clear that these are the values with which we are talking about, it is possible to work with it. So Smith was born in Scotland, studied at Balliol College. A trivia, not a very happy experience in Oxford. He found that people had even given up the pretense of teaching. They spent enormous amounts of time in profound silence. And Smith put it down to the fact that they had assured income. So because the performance and their income was not really matched or related to each other, they really didn't need to teach. So far from what we think of Oxford was what Smith experienced in those days. Now, the world of Adam Smith, or at least Adam's own mental state, was very hopeful, optimistic, and one which was full of harmony. This is very important to understand. I mean, neither Smith nor Ricardo were fools, but Smith, as I said, was not an economist. He was a professor of moral philosophy, later theology, jurisprudence, and political economy. So, at the University of Glasgow, he believed in the essential kind of purpose of all the elements that were integrated in the cosmos. So there was harmony about it. So even when he recognized, and he did that, and many of you looked at personally, even at Smith, would recognize the various kind of quotes that are very famous. I am deliberately not quoting anything, not the Butcher quote, not the other quotes. But this quote, where I'm referring to, obviously has to kind of do with the fact that he says, whenever the rich people meet for parties, they kind of end up increasing the price. Their interests are, of course, against those of the poor and so on and so forth. So he recognized that. He recognized the fact that young children were sent to the mines and to work for 14 hours a day, and so on. Not something that a good philosopher or a theologian would like, definitely. However, the point is, that was not the crucial center or the electromotive force. The conflict was not part of that kind of a Smithian kind of a system. He was a hopeful, harmonious guy. It was like we are family kind of, everyone going up together. And that's why the trickle down effect that he had. He was a deep and an absent-minded scholar. There is a story about how one night he got up in his gown and walked for 15 miles, falling into a tanning pit. Then somebody recovered him and got him back, and so on. So he was that kind of a person. Funnily, in his book, he tries to be practical. Now, this is something, again, hits in almost, like, you say, we find for what is not. So this guy is a philosopher who's hardly ventured out into the real world of practical kind of economics or anything like that, but wants to decorate his work and his book with a lot of practical examples and practical issues. In contrast, again, Ricardo is somebody who was a very practical person. And I will come to that when I elaborate on it. But his is an analytical approach. It's a theoretical approach. That's the first theoretical approach that Ricardo had. Now, theory of moral sentiments, which Smith wrote several years earlier in his avatar as a philosopher, is probably, and Smith himself certainly considers that to be his best work. When he died around that time, he thought he would have worked more on Wealth of Nations, which he published in 1776. But 1776 book got him an immediate fame as the person of laissez-faire, let the market be, don't interfere, and that kind of stuff. Now, the important methodological point I want to make is, once you write something or once you propose a theory, it's no more yours. How it is interpreted later on by others is not something that you have a complete control over. So, for example, Smith wouldn't have liked the fact that his book was waived in the parliament to defend the practice of child labor. Said government should not interfere with this child. Let the market speak. They will find the thing. Smith, of course, believed that the do-gooders do no good. Don't try to do any good, he would say. You seek for yourself. But remember, this again sometimes has been interpreted as class selfishness. That is no part of Smithian thinking. He was a harmony philosopher. So for him, everybody was a family. So when he thought of himself and doing well, it was everybody along with he himself as an individual person. So you need to keep that in mind. But he became immediately famous after the 1776 Wealth of Nations. And I like the William Pitt because he was Prime Minister then. And when he went to visit William Pitt, Pitt along with his cabinet people all stood up and Mr. Pitt told Smith, he said, "Sir, please sit down." Smith said, "You please sit." And he said, "Not till you have sat. We are all your scholars." So that was the kind of admiration and popularity he had even in the highest powers. His overpowering message was of growth. Neither the concern for development or distribution are part of Smithian world. Okay. First time you hear of distribution proper is Ricardo. Just as first time you hear of conflict as the electromotive force of the theoretical framework is Marx. It's neither Smith nor Ricardo that you find conflict as a thinking forward kind of driving the theoretical frames of these two people. So for him, it was growth. So anything to do for growth. And the classical thing that we all study, C plus accuracy and the marginal propensity to consume of the poorer sections is one, and therefore the savings propensity becomes zero and all that. So the subsistence wage, etc., etc. I'm taking all that as given and understood by all of you. And he was all right with that because he thought that with growth, grow the pie, that will help everybody because it was for everybody. The basic analytic unit of his work was an individual. But as I've been saying indirectly, there is no conflict between individual qua individual. Individual as a member of the family, individual as a member of the nation or the group. So it is all one kind of no internal something that later on a lot of work has been done by Becker and others that you people would know about how within organizations there would be different motivations and so on. Smith had none of that. For him, an individual was motivated, socially motivated, as against socially determined, which is the case with Marx. Although my teacher, Kanthar and Dev, would be there always to remind me that word determined is wrongly translated. The word to be used there should be conditioned, not determined. Yeah, but whatever it is, the point here is that Smith basically wanted to have an individually motivated kind of a socially motivated kind of an individual, and that was the basic. The puzzle that he set out to resolve was that how come that an economy that is there, which has got atomistic decision makers, thousands of them in an uncoordinated fashion making these decisions, and yet it all seems to hang together in some coherent way. How does that happen? Certainly not the government's doing. He would not like it, that was not the part of it. And he would think of markets as the thing. And he used the word invisible hand. Now this is, I particularly put this here, despite the fact that these addresses are all universally known, and if I were to say that Smith, now to give me a word, you would give me invisible hand, I'm sure. Right? Another instance of how, and the author probably didn't think of that as a big deal. Because invisible hand is mentioned only once in the passing in that Colossus of a book. And yet, that is used by everybody and is known to even the lay people. So that is the use that was put to of Smith's kind of work. Um, he was a systems builder and a pioneer, and that's why some people like to call him the grandfather, not the father of economics, because unlike the researchers who kind of look at the syntax and the references and so on and so forth, he was not careful. He was a pioneer. He was breaking down different words and conquering new words, kind of. In doing so, he's full of contradictions. That is true. But at the same time, almost everything today you can link back in a generic sense to what Smith had said sometimes. So in some senses, Smith is like the Mahabharata, all the stories are told kind of after Smith. But with a lot of contradictions, because you would have to have them. And a couple of them I would mention as we go along. Theory of value is one of the contradictions that we had. Now, is it the embodied labor that you expend in order to create a table or a chair? Or is it in the next sentence he says, however, the real value of a thing is something that the other person is ready to exchange for. So is it the exchange value or the embodied value? Now, somebody who was interested in growth would want exchange value. But the value theory that we learn as students from textbooks is the embodied version of Smith. And the two obviously don't go together. There's a clear contradiction between the two. As I just mentioned, despite seeing poverty around, it was not central theoretical concern for Smith. It would take 200 years before the issue of development would be taken up in an ILO mission in Kenya in this century, last century. This idea of stationary state is, I always think it's an afterthought. It's about the time when even in literature, we require nice, for children, you require nice plots. So you have a protagonist, you have a villain, you have a nice story, and it ends many times happily ever after, or many times with tragedy. Smithian world, which is a hopeful world, which in technical terms is a capital output ratio falling all the time. The dynamics of technology talks of, although the illustration it gives is of a big factory, because those were not days when you had high the budgets and so on and so forth. So, in such a world, what is the meaning of this sentence that is, when all the complements of riches are reached? This is like one of the sentences in economics, which is packed, which is nice. An example that comes to my mind, which my friend Frank Hahn used to often quote, is from Milton Friedman. He said, Friedman said that inflation is and will always be a monetary phenomenon. And Frank would look at us and say, now, it's like saying price of butter is a butter phenomenon. Now, how insightful is that? What does it mean? But it sounds good. Yeah. So this sounds good. But what does it mean? In a dynamic world where there is an ever-changing technology and the capital output ratio is falling, and there is the other logical contradiction that I mentioned there, which is, he said how with competition prices would come down. And that for him, I think they would come down because he wrote price is equal to the rate of return on rent plus wages plus which were fixed plus the profit rate and so on. There's a contradiction there. A fall in the price due to competition does not lead to fall in profit rate. Because profit rate is a return on the unit of capital. If capital output ratio is falling in a technologically dynamic world, the two are not necessary. But these are minor kind of illogics that are there in Smith. He was clearly a proponent of open economy. Pragmatically, also reacting to merchandise. As we said, all scholars basically react to what was going on earlier. But remember, the other famous things like Smith that we know of is the dexterity, the division of labor, specialization. He understood that after all, we're not interested in production per se. We are interested in production because we want returns as entrepreneurs or producers and so on. And that would happen only if there are markets. And then in a closed economy, the markets would be limited. So the only way this whole thing goes through is you have international markets. And that's why the open economy kind of philosophy that he had, apart from his philosophical bent of mind, could have been also contributing to this kind of thing. But what Smith was giving was hope and a blueprint for what was emerging as the new world across the Atlantic. And a few years later, very soon, in 40 years, in fact, from the time he wrote, the whole thing changed. It became topsy-turvy. And we come to the tragic world of David Ricardo. Ricardo was only 4 years old when kind of Smith published his Wealth of Nations, 1772. And Ricardo was not schooled. It is very important to understand this, that Ricardo he was not a scholar, he was not a philosopher. He was an exceedingly bright man, a practical fellow who made enough money to retire at his 40s, which is a great thing. But unfortunately, he comes between Smith on one hand and Marx on the other, both giant philosophers and scholars and so on. So we tend to overread Ricardo sometimes and look at, because in Smith, having been influenced by David Hume, he would talk of value as something that is intangible, that flows through all things and stuff like that. In Marx, it was very clear that value is a social relationship. For Ricardo, it was a very, very simple, practical problem. He knew as a man of the world that he incidentally made his money on foreign markets, but that's aside. So don't overread Ricardo. His issue was very simple. It was that as a practical person, he knew that the input basket is heterogeneous. The output basket is heterogeneous unless you say no joint production, single production, which is a simplification of this work, but that's fine. But if you take this, how do you treat this heterogeneity? How do you compare? Technically, for those of you who are mathematics trained, would understand what I'm saying. That anything more than one dimension in mathematics, say the Rn Euclidean space, is not a linearly ordered space. It's a partially ordered space. You can't compare the two a priori. So you require a dotting matrix in order to convert it into some number, which can then be compared with some other number to know which is where its cost basket is higher or lower or whatever. Incidentally, since I'm talking of mathematics, the mathematical theorem says that this is the only way in which a well-behaved function can be created. But that's another story. That's not something that either Ricardo or Smith were talking about. But he kind of had this healthy cynicism towards book learning. Again, a story. Once he wandered into his son's college and was happy to find that the son was not in the class. So he said, that's good. He is not being book learned. So, comparative advantage. Because Smith and Ricardo, because Ricardo was reacting to most of the things that Smith was talking about, two of the things in particular that I mentioned here, one is of course the value theory, but the other one is the international thing. Ricardo, of course, was all for open economy. In fact, in the parliament, he made a very fervent speech against the corn laws, which were in 1814, I think, around that time. And he gave us this comparative advantage. And Samuelson was asked by some big physicist once, said, can you mention a single contribution in economics which is comparable to second law of thermodynamics? And Samuelson said, comparative advantage. It's a great thinking, and I don't know there is international economics people sitting here, but including my wife, who knows more about international economics than me. But I don't think intellectually, beyond comparative advantage, much has happened. There is another tragic or negative thing that has happened also, which I will mention incidentally. But that's why I mentioned comparative advantage, which is far better or requires far greater intellectual theorizing than Adam Smith's simple thing. Just as I'm going to talk about in a moment, about the invariant measure of value, the numeraire, the search for the numeraire kind of a thing. Smith also had this, but that was a simple-minded thinking. As a teacher, I come to the class and say, okay, this is 2 feet. And tomorrow I come and say, this is 3 feet. Now you should either conclude that something is wrong with me, or that something is wrong with the idea of a foot that I am using. And that can't be variant. That has to be the same. So something must have happened to the table. And that is a simple childlike understanding of invariant measure of value. Ricardo had a nuanced kind of thinking and of addressing it. So whereas, as I said, he was an exceedingly bright person and managed to comfortably retire very, very early, his idea of value or value theory, he simply was, give me a numeraire which is usable, so that I can convert the heterogeneity of the real world into homogeneous. From Rn to R, a functional that I can convert from Rn to R, because R is a completely ordered field, right? So R I can compare any two numbers. There is law of dichotomy that works there. So whereas Smith had a value connotation, as I just mentioned, influenced by Hume, and Marx, it was social thing. For him, it was only the intermediation vector, the dotting vector. You can call it price vector, which emerges from markets, or you can call it something that comes from the programming of dual. Those of you, all of you must be knowing linear programming. So the dual gives you the what we in economics sometimes term as shadow markets, where the markets themselves are missing. The programming kind of whatever you do, you require. So in a passage of 40 years since you presented a hopeful thing, we come to a situation where this optimism is completely given up and you come see the real underbelly of the real world, industrial revolution and so on and so forth. Children working, poverty all around, fights going on and so on. Again, this still does not I still don't categorize Ricardo as a conflict theorist, because for him the conflict was between, as I shall mention in a moment, between the rentiers and the capitalists, between the haves, not between the haves and the have-nots, which is the real conflict which Marx finished for, which we shall do on 6th of April, everything permitting. So the primary question of political economy for Ricardo was, how do the factors that come together to produce a national dividend, how do they distribute that, the parceling of the national dividend into the factors of production? Note that Smith had nothing like this. He had a range. So there was no real theory of distribution. Ricardo had the beginnings of the theory of distribution, although he does not have the theory of origin of profits. He assumes that profits are added. And then what happens, he tells us a brilliant story. But there is no theory of emergence of profit. For that, we need to wait for Marx again. So, the story, this is something that all of you probably are aware of, but I'll go through that very, very fast, is of a fledgling capitalism. Hall model is the one that he uses, and he says, it's all right, there's an entrepreneurial group that's involved in the dynamic progression of the economy. There's growth that is taking place. They are investing and creating growth, etc., etc. In doing that, what happens is that you require more labor. So the population keeps on increasing almost in an endogenous fashion. Although typically classicals would have treated it as an exogenous one, even endogenously, the population increase would have to happen because there was need for increase in labor, both in order to construct new machines and also to work on the negotiations, both of them. But when more people are required and then people are born, and in economics we oftentimes have this habit of putting L there, which means labor, but really it's population. And we say there is some correlation or connect between the two. One stands for the other. That's the proxy. So he talks about when people are born, they first come with mouths. Their hands come later to work. So you require more corn. If you require more corn, you require the agriculturists to do both what we have called in our textbooks and other places as intensive and extensive production. And when you go for intensive and extensive production, and you go further and further from the nice efficient markets, you go finally far away. And Thornton was actually somebody who talked about transportation economics and how that would reduce the cost and so on. But that's not required logically for Ricardo. His logic was very simple. As you go further and get up to the inferior ranks, the cost of producing a unit of corn would go up. And that, at the margin, will be determining the price of corn. Now, the guy who was sitting on the superior lines in the first place will be getting this differential. This is how the differential of the rent emerges in Ricardo, for which Ricardo claims that guy has done nothing. Who has done something? It's the entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs work, they invested, they worked hard on, with the machines and so on, setting up industries, and see what the result is. The result is that as one moves away to cultivate the lands, you have this. So the price of corn kinds of goes up, and the price of corn at the margin and price of corn on the superior lands to begin with at P0 you have. That differential is what the rent which I'm sitting there owning that land, and for that I'm given this. This is the unearned income according to Ricardo. And Ricardo is very explicit when he says that the interests of the rentiers is inimical to the interests of the society. Very, very clear statement. And there is also the Thomas Robert Malthus, who you can't leave out when you talk of Ricardo. There are volumes of the correspondence between the two. Very sincere. Thomas Robert Malthus, unfortunately, extremely underrated, according to me, as an economist, as a demographer, and other things we know of Malthus in theory. But he pointed out to Ricardo that possibly it is buying of this land could be foresight and thrift, a result of that. But Ricardo was so bright that he was able to just brush him aside and say, what nonsense are you talking about? And the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, the first professor of economics, appointed to the India office in India Administrative Services, was somebody who kind of had to keep quiet. So also he had to keep quiet when he could have almost anticipated things. When he talked to when he talked to Ricardo, he wrote to him and said, you talk to the sales of markets, it may not work. People might want to vote. And Ricardo very simply said that you must be completely mad or irrational to hold money, which is not giving you anything. Any rational person will invest. Again, you had to wait till Keynes came around 100 years later for that. But Thomas Robert Malthus brought up these things. But what happened to Ricardian, what was the Ricardian model? The Ricardian model was as the progress happened, the profits increased to begin with, which were invested, the corn demand increased. Yes, so there was, and also Ricardian idea of subsistence labor was slightly higher, not different from Smithian. It was not subsistence, it was socio-psychologically determined. So it had some buoyancy there. So that package increased. On the other hand, because of the differential income, the rents increased. And there was a double squeeze on the national dividend. So that was the tragedy of the Ricardian system, with inexorable logic. The people who started doing this and putting in the dynamics of it were the people who were kind of double squeezed and they went away. And therefore, stationary state in Ricardo is very much an integral part and emerges out of the logic of his model. It's a different thing that
Sorry, one question.
Yeah.
So did Ricardo go that extra step to talk about property rights, to the landlord property rights? Which are-
No, he did.
We had to wait for March for that.
Yes, again, for that. In fact, Thomas Robert Malthus writes in a way, says, no one can doubt our sincerity. Because here is Thomas Robert Malthus, who never owned any piece of land, talking on behalf of these rentiers, the landlord. And here is David Ricardo, who is perhaps one of the most biggest landlords, who is saying that their interests are inimical to the interests of the society. So that was the integrity with which they fought their battles. But he didn't go much further. He had something else to worry about, theoretically, actually, which is what I come to. Open trade and comparative advantage, I've already mentioned this. Absolutely brilliant kind of theoretical constructs. Let me turn to his theory of value. And as I said, numeraire is what he wanted. But a numeraire he wanted was not a numeraire which was invariant over time. That was clear. I mean, that was Chinese thinking. He wanted a numeraire which was invariant over distributional shocks. Because remember, none of them were going to use, thanks to Napoleonic Wars and the volatility in the value of money, no one classically used money as a numeraire. They had a classical disdain for money. In fact, Hicks, another famous economist who I like extremely, his writings especially, were asked once, why is it that during this time there was no great advance in monetary economy? And his answer was, it's difficult to write brilliant answers to mundane questions. So there were no great questions being asked of money in those days. So there was no forthcoming of any great monetary theory or advances that were happening. So following Hayek, I read somewhere that Hayek was the one who characterized these two problems that Ricardo faced, really, were related to numeraire. One was what we will call as Ricardo problem number one. It was, suppose we use the simple characterization as we do, Q max equal to FAL, and of course, Ricardo understood that L has scales and then heterogeneity, etc., etc. But he's keeping the model very simple. Now, he said, now I want to estimate what is the commodity I should use to measure the numeraire problem. And after trying several different commodities, he said, let me use, again, for mathematics people, he used a simple projection function. Note, Q max is equal to FKL, he said project L down and L will stand for the value of the commodity. Please understand, Ricardo did not have an embodied labor theory of value. That's why Stigler has written a paper called 93% theory of value of Ricardo. Yeah, he only was claiming proportionality between labor content and value, not equal or measure, and so on. So here is the problem. The problem is you need to measure the indirect labor also, which is there in K. But K, you come up with vintage problem. Because you come up with a T problem, T0, T1, T2. Different machines have different years of production. Now, all of us economists know, I mean, even if you're not an economist, you should know this, that if you have a series of L1, L2, L3, which you want to now aggregate and add to L that is there explicitly, if these are referring to different time periods, then you need a discount value. You can't just add up L1, L2, right? But in equilibrium, as von Neumann was to teach us much later, 1920s paper, 1940s paper, no, 20s paper, the equilibrium problem, where it was to show that in equilibrium, the discount rate, the profit rate, the growth rate all have to be the same. But here is the circularity problem. Now, you are set out to find a solution, but you need to know that solution in order to get the discount rate. This was Ricardo's problem number one. The Ricardo problem number 2 is more complicated. And that was that if there is a distributional shock, now if you are using some commodity, yes, this commodity has an underlying capital labor ratio. If there is a distributional shock, then all the relative prices will change. If the relative prices change of everything, they must also change for that commodity which you have chosen as the numeraire. The one in terms of which you are going to measure everything. Now, for that not to happen, what must happen is the impossible condition that K upon L and regression has to be the same standard average K upon L. Now, Ricardo was too much of a practical man to know that different industries will have the same capital labor ratio, obviously, especially over a period of time and so on. So he gave up and he forgot about that particular problem. On his dying day, he said, this is one problem that I have not been able to solve, and he suspected that it would be insurmountable. A problem that was solved much later, published in 1960 by Feroz Shrafa's work. Keynes had kind of imported him from Italy as a young man in 1920s to Cambridge, and Feroz Shrafa then worked on this particular problem. And what he did was, he created, obviously there can't be one single commodity which will have these impossible assumptions. So he thought of a vector of commodities. And these vector of commodities are such that their inherent capital labor ratios are such that they would move in counterbalancing ways, such that the whole vector as a unit remains stable. And that becomes the standard unit which Shrafa solved, taking 40 years to publish his work, starting with 1920s when the early ideas were already with him. But he published those in 1960s in a small little book, horribly written, because I don't think Feroz Shrafa was a mathematically trained person. So he uses small a's and b's as suffixes and so on. It's extremely irritating to people like me who are used to more sophisticated, more disciplined way of writing IJs here and A's and X's in different places. But they are dummy holders, so you can't blame Shrafa for that. These are only placeholders. But that is where, when I teach this, I think of, think of Mahabharata. You know, what were we looking for? We were looking for a commodity which had this horrendously different characteristics inherent in it. It was like Draupadi, who wanted a brave, handsome, religious, and so on person. The only way you could find that was not in one man. You had to have all the 5 Pandavas to be the composite commodity. So it was the composite commodity that Shrafa gave us in this, particularly noteworthy that I'm talking here because V.M. Dandekar, whom all of us know as a great scholar of Berkeley Institute, has used Shrafi's framework. A lot of work has happened. In his South Country lecture that he gave, the R.C. Dutt Memorial Lecture, which he gave where he took forward the work of Ranjit Sahu and of course the outside of the, all the Marxist people. Of course, Dandekar was not. And to this day, Rajas continues to work on using this for open economy stuff. I'm waiting for a day. He's promised me he'll give a seminar on this very soon. He's made some breakthroughs. But so Shrafian framework is very much alive in Berkeley Institute. This we shall do next time if the time comes on 6th of April. Thank you very much.